Hello, everyone. So, obviously, things are a little bit different than they were when we last met before spring break. We are going to be working together for the rest of the term to finish up this course online. I know that it's going to be a transition for some of you. I think for others, you'll find it to be an advantage. But either way, we have to make sure we work together and do whatever we can to finish strong and complete ultimately all the requirements and responsibilities that we have as both students and instructors for these courses and overall your degree completion. So let me just begin by discussing the course framework for the rest of the term. First and foremost, this week I'm going to require a mandatory check-in. There will be a discussion board thread, and each student will be required to simply log in and give a check-in status. How are you doing? Um, are you going to be able to connect to a computer over the next 7 weeks to complete the online assignments? Do you have any concerns or questions about things that have happened within the course? Please remember that I have no control over the administrative decisions being made at the university, whether it's housing or student requests to administrators. I just don't have any input or any insight into how those decisions are being made. So unfortunately, I won't be able to answer any of those questions for you. That said, if there's anything that has to do with the course, I am doing my best to reconfigure everything on the fly. I think I have a pretty good structure, but if you have any questions or concerns about the course, please contact me as soon as possible, either through the discussion board or through a direct email. So there are 7 weeks left in the course, starting tomorrow, this Monday, and we will be starting up the course back in week 10. So that will be the material. The materials haven't changed. Um, there is a syllabus, a new updated syllabus that I will have sent to you both by email, sent all of you by email, and I will also upload the syllabus to Canvas. Um, in terms of finishing out this term, what are your responsibilities as students? So we are not going to have any major tests for the rest of the term. I just am not comfortable with giving large tests electronically online. Too many things could go wrong. And so we are going to focus on discussion board submissions and weekly quizzes as the primary assignment structures moving forward. The discussion boards, what it is it's an area, it's a link on the left-hand side of your Canvas page. You open it up, and it's just like a discussion board online, only instead of topics about hip hop or clothes, it's topics associated with the course. Each discussion board is going to be broken down by the week, so you know which week you are posting in. Students are required to make one post by Thursday, and that one post is a minimum one-page discussion of any aspect of the materials presented for this week. So this week we're going to be talking about the judiciary. It is there are a variety of different things that you can talk about, from individual justices to key Supreme Court cases going back through history, strengths and weaknesses of the Supreme Court, checks and balances, its relationship with other branches of government. Um, there are so many different ways in which you can discuss this. The key is each student must make one post. That post must focus on a specific aspect of the judicial system. Again, case, organization, people, it's your choice. That post has to be a minimum of 1 page in length, i.e. about 2 paragraphs, and it should directly incorporate course materials into the discussion. That post must be made by Thursday at midnight. You are not required to cite specifically sources in the response, but you must still indicate if it's a direct reference to a source through the utilization of quotation marks and preferably citations, but you still can't cut and paste. Do not plagiarize, and that includes each other's work. After the Thursday post, each student is then required to pick two of their classmates' posts and make replies. The reply must be a minimum of 1 paragraph in length and must directly and specifically discuss what the student posted about. This is to encourage not only engagement of course materials in a more direct way, but it will also ensure engagement of students with each other. The second primary assignment is the weekly quiz. There will be weekly quizzes directly available on Canvas. You will click on the link. Once you start the quiz, it is a 15-minute timed quiz that you cannot stop in the middle. Don't start the quiz until you're able to finish it, i.e., sit down for 15 straight minutes. There are only 5 questions, but the questions are specific to the readings in particular, or quizzes, or videos. And each question is 8 points, with the weekly quiz totaling 40 points. I really think that the structure is based on effort. If you just do the basic requirements, post to discussion board, complete your weekly quizzes, you cannot fail unless you get every question wrong, in which case you're not taking any time at all to actually do the reading. The final paper will be discussed more specifically in an upcoming narration / PowerPoint. I will also make sure that there are clear directions posted on Canvas. The final paper will essentially be a rewrite of your first paper. It will focus specifically on better grammar, use of citations and reference materials, and proper formatting. In other words, your final paper needs to be a better version of your first paper. I offered many comments and points of feedback on the different submissions, and so you should all have plenty of information with which to go through and improve that submission. So my instructor, my responsibilities. First and foremost, I am going to be producing a weekly PowerPoint with narrated slides. This should go a long way in helping to lay out some of the key aspects, definitions, and understandings of the essential concepts being presented within the readings and the videos for the week. Again, if you have any questions or issues, you can either email me directly, or there will be a discussion board thread through which you can post whatever questions you might have about the class. I will have virtual office hours. That means that I will be basically sitting in front of my computer. I'm looking to try and figure out how to do the Canvas. Give me a second. I'm actually looking at the Canvas screen right now. I'm trying to figure out how to do the Canvas conference or live chat. But either way, it will be a point at which you can email me and expect an email response immediately. During that period of time, once I get the live conferencing up and running, you'll be able to live chat with me on any questions or issues you might have regarding the course, course materials, or just finishing the semester in general. So, we're working along. We're trying to do everything we can to improve this experience, and at least make sure that everybody gets through it with what they need to get done, with the students being the primary concern by far. In that regard, I promise I will be committed to timely communication and grading so that you all know where you stand at any given moment. A lot of it will be automated. For instance, the weekly quizzes, you'll know exactly what your grade was as soon as you get finished. So there it is. The secret to success in online education is really only one secret, and it's about organization and commitment. If you do the tasks being laid out before you, you will succeed. That's that simple. If you don't get your Thursday discussion boards in, you're going to lose points. If you don't write a full page, if you don't take the time to look at the textbook while you're writing out your answers, you're going to lose points. It's not a matter of understanding because you have all the materials in front of you. There's never anything I'm going to be able to ask you that you won't be able to look up. So in the end, it's really just about doing the work. And in that regard, the people that do the best in online education are the people that are well organized. So I would have 4 to 5 hours a week set aside to do the work for this course. 1 hour a day for 4 or 5 days, whatever it takes. But if you wait until Thursday night or you wait until Sunday night to try and do your work, you're really going to be shooting yourself in the foot. So, again, I trust me when I tell you I am just as discombobulated and turned upside down by everything going on as you guys are. I'm entering my second week of staying at home, and it's definitely a different transition. So just know that my thoughts and prayers are with you all. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone is healthy. And I promise you, just as was the case before, I am here. Please contact me if you are having issues or questions. If there's anything I can help with, I will do my best to do so. All right. So, one of the goals for this week's lecture is to introduce the War on Terror as it was defined immediately following 9/11. We've talked quite a bit about the evolution of terrorism over the last century, from the first wave of anarchist terrorism to the modern day of extremist religious terrorism, or modern stage, if you will. We've talked about how there has been difficulty throughout all four of the phases of terrorism in defining both the act of terrorism and the terrorist. And as terrorism's evolved, it's becoming even more complicated when you consider things like state sponsorship. And so, one of the things that we want to talk about this week is how 9/11 itself specifically defined the war on terror. And it's important to know that at the very beginning, it was the global war on terrorism. And the reason why it was labeled that way was first because George Bush worked really hard to put together an international alliance of nations that were going to work with the United States to combat this new threat of international terrorism. And again, the key here is that he wasn't, or at least the initial definitions didn't focus on the individuals, i.e., global war against terrorists. It focused on the psychology of terrorism that seemed to have now spawned a new type of terrorist organization, Al Qaeda. It's important to remember one of the moments of definition for the war on terror is when George Bush says very clearly that in this new war, you are, quote, either with us or against us. And that went a long way to defining what people thought was the war on terror, at least at the time. I think in hindsight, you could argue that it was a somewhat problematic statement because if it is difficult to separate terrorists from freedom fighters, for instance, then has become just as difficult to identify enemies and allies at times within the war on terror itself. And so, as much as the Bush administration, and to be clear, all of the other successive administrations from Obama to Trump, America in general has really wanted the war on terror to be clearly defined, not just for its own citizens, but relative to what the United States sees as its global role of leadership. And so the conflict itself has evolved, um, and in the end, I think the name or the label has stayed the same. And so, my own perspective, it seems to me that even the impact of the term war on terror isn't quite what it used to be. One of the things that really plays into this definition of the war on terror immediately following 9/11 are the number of specific outcomes that resulted from the terrorist attacks. So first we have the Department of Homeland Security, or the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It's an interesting concept because the very notion of the homeland really wasn't used within U.S. foreign policy or even political language until 9/11. It was important to understand how much there was a shift in both U.S. foreign policy and the average American's perspective of our vulnerability, and that the vulnerability that was exposed by 9/11 went a long way towards refocusing U.S. security efforts internally, as opposed to, for instance, the international focus that the United States had had throughout the Cold War. Another key component of the results of 9/11, or the outcomes of 9/11, was the U.S. Patriot Act, which in fact I'm going to talk a little bit more about on a later slide, so I don't want to get too deep into it now. Essentially, if the Department of Homeland Security was a readjustment of U.S. understanding of where our vulnerabilities lie, the U.S. Patriot Act was a recognition that we might have to give up some civil liberties or even civil rights in support of these new security measures. And in the end, the Patriot Act would be dismantled to a degree, and you can kind of ask the question yourself as to whether or not it served its purpose at the time. Guantanamo Bay, or the development of Gitmo, as its nickname goes, was also an important outcome from 9/11. It represented a policy of basically going after the terrorists by any means necessary. And the primary means or policy that was used was a policy that was called rendition. Basically, what it meant was if we captured terrorists on the battlefield or through intelligence operations, or if we captured terrorists through, for instance, criminal or intelligence investigations, that those individuals would then be whisked away to Guantanamo Bay and interrogated to see what else they could tell us, not just about Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, but potential attacks. Now, the rendition program basically stretched around the world, and um, once it was discovered, two issues came to light. First, the question of whether or not these individuals that were being uh, arrested or detained based upon suspicions of being associated with terrorism, whether or not they were still uh, should be allowed human rights, basic human rights, from being actually charged with a crime to legal representation. And the reality was that quite a few of them were being held without many basic civil liberties within Guantanamo Bay. And it led to a significant debate, not just within the United States, but across the international human rights uh, agenda. A second component of the Guantanamo Bay or Gitmo prison dynamic was the realization that the United States was using questionable interrogation tactics, namely waterboarding, to try and get information out of suspected terrorists who were being held at Guantanamo Bay. Um, this further caused significant questions and issues regarding just what the United States was willing to do to fight the war on terror. How much would we have to become like our enemy, so to speak, to win the war? And how much were we willing to do that? These were all key questions that came out of the immediate result of 9/11. And I think when you look at the way in which the war on terror as a whole has been defined over time, each of these had key influences on that definition. Changes in airport security. I think in many ways that was the most practical and lasting aspect of our domestic memory of 9/11. The invasion of Afghanistan continues to be a central component of U.S. foreign policy to this day, almost 20 years later. Um, just like both the administrations before him, President Trump has struggled significantly with how to engage, or more precisely disengage, U.S. from Afghanistan and the continuing fight against the Taliban and numerous other terrorist and quasi-terrorist entities within Afghanistan. It kind of begs the question of what exactly the goals of the war on terror are. Considering bin Laden's been dead for a good 7, 8 years now, why are we still in Afghanistan? What are the goals? And finally, we can talk about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's going to be a little bit past ultimately what we're looking at here, but you have to include the invasion of Iraq as one of the defining outcomes of 9/11 when it comes to understanding the war on terror. Whatever questions individuals might have had about the reasoning, strategies, and goals involved with the invasion of Afghanistan, I think the questions regarding the invasion of Iraq 2 years later were even more pronounced. And if you consider the continued instability in Iraq, the rise of ISIS in northern Iraq due to the power vacuum that was created when Saddam Hussein was removed from power, when you consider the impact of a destabilized Iraq on regional geopolitics and ultimately the issues that are taking place in Syria even right now, you have to question just how much was the United States following a clear strategy, at least in the early stages of the war on terror, and how successful has that strategy been? So, in continuing to look at America's reactions to 9/11, again, we see a lot of things took place in kind of a hasty or ad hoc manner. The Patriot Act was passed relatively quickly when you consider just how much was involved, not just in funding terms, but in terms of restructuring the U.S. intelligence community and, in fact, restructuring the government's relationship with its own citizens when it comes to things like privacy and surveillance. Um, there were lots of violations, or at least, I guess, depending on how you define lots, but many would argue that there were significant violations of civil liberties and civil rights, not just of suspected terrorists, but of American citizens as well. There were individuals who were detained on pure suspicion with little to no direct evidence of involvement with others who might either be part of a terrorist organization or at least have dangerous sympathies. There was surveillance of these individuals. There was, I remember, a real focus on the idea of see something, say something. And while it seemed like a good idea relative to promoting increased vigilance within the community towards potential terrorist threats, the reality is that it combined with a growing Islamophobia at the time, so that the level of harassment against Muslim Americans and anyone who, frankly, who even looked like a Muslim American, for in fact, Sikhs and other Central Asian uh, minorities within the United States were all horribly treated at the time. And frankly, a lot of people were okay with it. They felt it was a necessary reaction to what had happened on 9/11. So, when we look at the government response, we can talk about it in terms of two different approaches that the government took. On one hand, there was a defensive set of responses or a set of defensive strategies. And I think a lot of these focused around um, increasing security in the United States, especially relative to this specific set of individuals that we now saw as a threat. So, as long as we could protect ourselves against uh, ext- extremist Muslims, um, everything was on the table. And what was interesting was the number of really extreme uh, security measures that were taken at airports initially was really driven almost by individual cases at times. One person trying to sneak explosives on in their underwear, and suddenly, the entire scanning process has changed. Um, it really seemed like a different time when it comes to what the American people were willing to uh, endure or accept when it came to improving security against potential terrorist threats. Um, the reality is that, at least I would argue, America's offensive responses to the 9/11 attacks were much more expansive and involved. Um, Obviously, we have been involved in Afghanistan and then, as I mentioned, Iraq for going on 20 years. But when you consider the number of countries that the United States is either directly or indirectly involved in now, it spans over 30 countries around the world, from the Philippines to Morocco. The United States has been intimately involved in anti-terrorism activities around the world for 2 decades. And I guess in my mind, I continue to ask the question, what is the goal? I don't question the strategies as much because, again, if there's a truth that can't be ignored, it's that the United States has not suffered another 9/11 type attack in 20 years. And so, whatever the strategies are, they must on some level be working. That said, I still feel compelled to ask what the long term strategy is. How will we know when the war is over? Or is this an endless and now essential part of understanding America's role in the international community? Islamophobia, or the irrational fear of Muslims, really exploded after 9/11. I mean, within hours after 9/11. It really resulted in a wide spread level of discrimination and initially even violence against, again, not just clearly Muslim Americans, but anyone who looked like a Muslim American. Anyone who looked Middle Easterner was potentially subject to some really vile and nasty behavior by the average American. And Islamophobia, I would argue, is another one of those lingering effects of 9/11 that, while no longer is pronounced, I think it has become a little bit more of an implied part of some people's political perspectives in America. Just it's one more group that you have to be keep an eye on, one more group that is potentially a threat to America. And so the question is, what is Islamic phobia, and where does it come from? What are the foundations of it in terms of Americans' often irrational understanding of Islam immediately following 9/11? Well, first and foremost, most Americans believe that Islam is monolithic and static. What that means is, first, that unlike the Christian faith, or Catholicism, which has numerous secondary churches and belief systems and readings of faith and sects, um, that somehow Islam is just one single book, one single reading of faith, and that all Muslims think the same thing. That's a really narrow minded understanding of Islam, but it fit quite neatly with the idea of making sure that, uh, frankly, America saw all Muslims as a potential threat. Immediately following 9/11, the average American simply didn't have the time or bandwidth to try and separate in their minds the idea of a good Muslim versus a bad Muslim. And so just coming to the belief that all Muslims are dot 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 was the easiest way to, just handle the situation. The static part comes in the idea that a lot of Western understandings of Islam revolve around the idea that Islam is a traditional, almost a pre-modern religion. That when you think Islam, you should still be thinking all the way back to the Crusades. That the philosophies and understandings that modern Muslims engage in aren't fundamentally different than those that were held by Muslims 1,000 years ago. And again, this helps breed that idea that all Muslims are a threat, because if the religion itself is monolithic, every Muslim thinks the same thing, and on top of that, nothing ever changes. Well, then all I have to do is think about you know the Hollywood movies that portray the Muslim Crusaders and the bloodthirst and the jihad, and I know everything I need to know about Muslims today. And that's absolutely one of the foundations of Islamophobia as it developed following 9/11. Another aspect of the American understanding of Muslims and the development of Islamophobia was the general idea of the other within American culture. Um, America has always had latent and sometimes very in your face xenophobic fears of the other, i.e., anyone not white, Anglo Saxon, English speaking. And so, in many ways, again, the fact that it was open quotes others close quotes that had attacked us on 9/11 only further kind of reinforced our latent xenophobia. Kind of a I told you that they didn't like us, and I told you that we couldn't trust them kind of perspective. Um, an additional aspect is that I mean, I believe we've talked a little bit about the idea of American exceptionalism and the belief by most Americans that our culture is not just better than most, but is actually unique in just how much better we are than most people. And so we build into this Islamic framework the idea that part of the reason they don't like us is that they're inferior to us, and we make those conclusions based upon cultural or societal or legal or political understandings of their society, having never actually been there. Um, More importantly, we tend to assume that everything in our country is the best, and so therefore, if you don't do it like we do, if you don't have what we have, then you are by definition somehow inferior. And that inferiority can lead to a wide variety of secondary perspectives about societies, and the Muslim society in particular, including the idea that they're barbaric or irrational, that they live primitive lives, or that uh, Muslim societies are by definition sexist. These are all really negative and frankly unsupported conclusions that are not only held by a number of Americans, but they really flourished and blossomed immediately following 9/11. And they all helped to further inform how we defined the war on terror precisely because it allowed us to demonize the enemy. If the enemy is inferior, if the enemy is barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist, then we simply don't have to feel as bad about killing them. And that's not something that's exclusive just to the war on terror. That's a psychological framework that every army in the history of man has had to develop in order to fight a war and shove a sword or shoot a bullet into another person. So, we look for these reasons to understand um, the war on terror and to figure out how it was been defined. But I think it'd be fair to say that in many ways, it was the definition of the war on terror was in part defined by how we had already come to define Middle Easterners and Islam before 9/11 even took place. Um, we had always seen the Middle East as violent and aggressive and the home of terrorism. It's just that prior to 9/11, um, terrorism was something that was over there. Again, taken something that was used by open quotes the others close quotes against open quotes the others. It wasn't something that was being used against us in our own homeland. And so when you consider the idea of how to respond to 9/11, there are a variety of different reasons why the United States very easily slipped into an Islamophobic framework. Um, one of the one of the important writings of the late 1990s, early 2000s was this book called The Clash of Civilizations. Basically, it was a book written by a man named Samuel Huntington, a professor, and in it he argued that following the Cold War, uh, the geopolitics of the world would be driven by what he called clash of civilizations, these broad frameworks of conflict that would exist um, across large regions. So, for instance, it would be the Western Europe against Islam and the Middle East. Um, the book paints a picture of basically the book was at the time both lauded or um, widely supported and also criticized because um, it seemed on one hand to capture a potential for conflict between um, various non-states following the Cold War, but at the same time it was doing it by making some rather broad and at times neo-racist kind of conclusions about who people were and how they saw each other. Um, and the irony of 9/11 and the War on Terror was that, as problematic as some of Samuel Huntington's arguments were in Clash of Civilizations, 9/11 and the War on Terror seemed to very neatly fit right into his arguments. And so, rather than questioning uh, who exactly we were at war with, how exactly the war was going to be fought, and ultimately what our goals were, it was easy to fall right into this idea of, well, let's just, you know, get at it because, well, this war was coming with with Islam anyway, and so it's time to fight it out. Um, the result is, after 20 years, I'm not so sure that anything has changed other than we haven't seen another 9/11. And if that's enough, then so be it. But the underlying perspectives of uh, Islam and the Middle East that might have led to their hatred and distrust of us in the first place still exist. And I think that's something that the United States is ultimately going to have to engage if we're ever truly going to win the war on terror. So, following 9/11, the United States invades Afghanistan. Um, it began almost immediately following the attacks, whereas the United States had special forces operating in Afghanistan within 3 weeks of the actual attacks on 9/11. Um, the amount of force quickly ramped up so that by the beginning of 2002, the United States had uh, tens of thousands of troops in conjunction with our allies in Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban. And so the goal here is that we're going after Osama bin Laden in particular as the head of Al Qaeda and the mastermind of 9/11. We know, or at least we know at the time, that he is using the mountainous areas in northern Afghanistan as his primary source or base of operations. The Taliban, who have been in control of the Afghan government for pretty much the entire decade since the 1990s, of the 1990s, they're giving bin Laden assistance and support and a sanctuary. And these are many of the reasons why Al Qaeda was able to so intricately plan and then pull off the attack on 9/11 is because they had this area where they could operate not just in peace, but they could operate under the protection of an actual state government. So the U.S. demands that the Taliban hand over bin Laden. They refuse to do so, and the U.S. Goes in a full invasion. Now, it really isn't that difficult to overthrow the Taliban as the head of the Afghan government, precisely because they are essentially a loose collection of dozens of warlords throughout Afghanistan, each with their own militia. And as much as the militias themselves are heavily armed with small arms, they lack anything close to the level of firepower or capability necessary to actually fight against the U.S. military. Ironically, it's the same situation that they had found themselves in after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1980. And so they did in 2001 what they had done in 1980. They took to the hills and they began to fall back on guerrilla tactics and strategies to fight the much stronger invader. The United States has multiple things that they are focused on um, once the fight actually gets rolling in Afghanistan. So first and foremost, their goal is to find Bin Laden and kill him. Second, their goal is to eliminate as much as possible Al Qaeda as an operational organization, as a terrorist organization, and as a threat to the United States. But again, the United States also recognizes that they're going to have to work to more broadly develop Afghanistan in order to create a platform upon which the country can move beyond both the Taliban and Al Qaeda. This means democratizing the state and then, on some level, improving its economic status. In other words, the United States has to engage in what's called nation building as an aspect of Operation Enduring Freedom. And as much as the United States has almost always been successful in purely military operations, it has often been associated attempts to democratize and economically develop states that has ultimately caused the downfall of U.S. Uh, military goals. And so, whether we're talking about Vietnam or Somalia, the issues that the United States were facing in Afghanistan, we had faced before. And ironically, after 20 years of intervention in the country, the same issues and outcomes that we saw in Vietnam exist in Afghanistan. Um, a moderate to no economic development at all relative to the amount of money spent due primarily to corruption within the government, an inability of the indigenous population to come together politically, um, the inability of the government to maintain and promote security relative to the irregular threat, whether they're terrorists or insurgents, um, the long-term investment that the United States has to make simply to maintain its efforts and not actually win. There's just so many similarities between the U.S. operations in Afghanistan and some of the other questionable interventions that the United States has had in its history uh, that it kind of surprises me that we're even still there. If you look through this timeline here, which ends in 2016, so ends 4 years ago, um, you'll see so much has taken place. There's so many ups and downs. There's been at least two different instances where presidents have claimed that the Taliban has been defeated and that Afghanistan is ready to get back on its feet. And then within no time at all, the Taliban seems to regroup and resurface, and the threats to international security and security in Afghanistan in particular all resurface. Ironically, the same exact dynamic has taken place less than a month ago. The Trump administration announced a potential truce and peace treaty in Afghanistan, and since that time, there have been numerous rather significant attacks across Afghanistan, including in major government centers against um, officials from all sorts of entities. And so, uh, again, you just have to kind of sit back and take a look at how the war on terror was defined. What sort of strategies were laid out, um, not just by George Bush when the war was initiated, but by subsequent presidents as it's evolved. Um, for instance, why wasn't there a significant withdrawal, if not a complete ending of the war on terror after killing bin Laden? Well, because it had evolved. We were no longer just focused on Al Qaeda. We were starting to look at groups like ISIS and Boko Haram as well. And so I don't think we've ever adequately engaged a redefining of the war on terror precisely because it probably wasn't as clearly defined as it could have been from the beginning. from a domestic perspective, the Patriot Act was certainly one of the most controversial outcomes of the immediate 9/11 era and the decision making that was taking place during that time. I think it's really important to understand how much it actually defined the early war on terror by making it a war. Specifically, if you weren't uh, on a frontline combat unit in Afghanistan, or if you weren't in the intelligence community trying to track down terrorists, um, probably the most direct sacrifice you were making as an American was this willingness to allow the government to begin investigating and surveying Americans as part of increased attempts to create security. The purpose of the U.S. Patriot Act was to prevent and punish terrorist acts in the United States and around the world. The key was, at least initially, was a massive increase in the investigative power of both criminal and intelligence agencies throughout the United States, at the state and federal levels. All sorts of agencies were given enormous amounts of money and freedom when it came to pursuing this new and deadly threat to the United States. The goal was to strengthen U.S. measures to prevent, detect, and prosecute international money laundering and financing of terrorism in particular. One of the key conclusions that came from recognizing the new organizational structures of modern terrorism was the degree to which they were going to be more reliant on financial systems than organizations in previous stages or eras of terrorism. So, for instance, uh, the left wing terrorists of the 1960s and 1970s were not using the international finance system to keep the organization afloat and their terrorist activities going. Uh, it was something that was fundamentally different. The idea that, Al Qaeda was using something like Wells Fargo to transfer money to individuals who were planning a terrorist attack while they were learning to fly at airports in Florida. It was a whole new level of international financial issues. And so, one of the goals of the United States very early on was to create not just more dynamic frameworks within the United States, but cooperative relationships across the world between the United States, between, for instance, the FBI and Interpol, or various other countries' intelligence and finance organizations, so that they could track the finances of these terrorist groups and then cut them off. There was really a fundamental focus on trying to deprive terrorist organizations of the money and materials necessary to engage in the sorts of large scale attacks that were symbolized by 9/11. Um, a variety of objections developed over time. It would be a lie to say that people were immediately against the Patriot Act. They just weren't. Following 9/11, the truth is that most people thought that we needed to do whatever we had to do, whether it was the Patriot Act or waterboarding. We needed to do whatever we had to do to make sure that there was never another 9/11. And if that meant increased surveillance, if that meant increased regulation of international finance, if that meant detaining individuals for suspected terrorism, even though they were U.S. citizens, then it was what it was. And people were willing to undergo it. But as time went by, more and more people started to have questions about the Patriot Act, not the least of which was whether or not basic constitutional freedoms were in danger, specifically the existence of civil liberties. And, well, some civil rights as they developed later on. So perhaps one of the most important ones was this idea of privacy. How much would the government or law enforcement agencies or the intelligence community, how much freedom would they now have in listening on your phone calls or intercepting your email exchanges? Should you be held to a different standard just because you happen to have relatives in a Middle Eastern country? There were so many different aspects to potential and actual violations of civil liberties and civil rights that I would argue it was probably the number one reason why eventually the Patriot Act was overturned. If you want to understand how all of these kind of issues come together, you don't have to look any further than the Edward Snowden incident, in which the Edward Snowden, the CIA analyst, steals a bunch of information off a classified um, website or classified server in the CIA, and then distributes it. Um, and distributes it to basically media sources trying to expose the unconstitutional or questionable uh, components of the Patriot Act and the activities of the intelligence community in particular. In the end, the argument was that once the threat had passed, or at least there was enough time had passed since 9/11 in particular, that the Patriot Act and what it represented was no longer uh, necessary relative to the existence of the terrorist threat itself. In other words, we'd given up our rights and our freedoms, or at least allowed them to be um, kind of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, we had allowed our freedoms and our civil liberties to be circumscribed by the government as long as there was a threat. Once that threat was over, that the way in which the government was able to go around some of those things needed to be changed immediately back to how it was. And so there are a variety of different, examples that you could go through, but in my mind, the Edward Snowden example is the best one to consider. So what do I want you to make sure that you take away from this week's material more than anything else? First and foremost is the idea that the war on terror was defined very simply and directly early on, and it was defined almost exclusively by the immediate cultural reaction to 9/11 itself. Um, there were individuals that hijacked those planes and flew those planes into the buildings, killing Americans. And so, as far as we were concerned, that was the enemy. And anybody that looked like them was the enemy if you were either with us or against us. The question of where is the enemy? Well, again, it was pretty clear in our minds that they were generally speaking in the Middle East, and specifically they were in Afghanistan. And so, if we're going to fight this war against terrorism, it's going to be fought in Afghanistan. Our argument from a strategic standpoint was, again, this was not just a war on terror, this was a global war on terrorism. It was something that required an entire, a complete global effort. And that's why, again, we ended up incorporating dozens of countries from around the world, most notably our NATO allies, into involvement in Afghanistan and then later on in other areas as well, including Iraq. The strategic goals, I don't think were quite as clear as the definition led us to believe. The idea of defeating the Taliban, of suddenly successfully nation building in Afghanistan, of eliminating terrorist psychology by eliminating bin Laden and Al Qaeda, I think those were all, frankly, mistakes that were made predominantly because we were reacting to the most incredible attack against the American homeland that had ever taken place since Pearl Harbor. And so, in many ways, the problem, it seems to me, in terms of determining the criteria for war, were that our strategic goals were not made with long term understandings of the war itself. They were made relative to short term reactions to the threat. We ended up, kind of, I think we ended up defining the war and then prosecuting the war on terror in much the same way as you try and find the perpetrator of a crime, somebody who's broken in your home. Um, the strategy is relatively simplistic and direct in terms of find out who did it, go and arrest them, and then bring them to justice. But if they broke into our home based upon a broader psychology that they and others were using to break into homes of people that look like me, well, then the strategy of crime fighting really becomes much less applicable in my mind. So, as far as the criteria for war, they were pretty plain and simple to understand immediately following 9/11. The question is, were they as simple as we understood them to be? And I think that's one of the reasons why it's worth examining the history of the war on terror. Uh, I talked about the role of xenophobia as a historical component of American culture and how the aspects of xenophobia, fear of the other, fear of individuals who do not practice our religion, speak our language, ultimately individuals who do not look like your average American. That fear has translated into our treatment of Native Americans and African Americans. It's translated into how we've treated various waves of immigrants throughout U.S. history. And frankly, following 9/11, there was really not too much of a difference. Only now, the broad sense of xenophobia that we'd held as a society could be focused down solely on the Muslim, in particular the Muslim male. And so you see an explosion of Islamophobia immediately following 9/11 that really can't be overlooked as a significant outcome. And I think the reason why it's a significant outcome, at least in part, is because it continues to inform the average American's understanding of not just the war on terror, but our relationship with the Middle East in general. Uh, two of the practical outcomes of the 9/11 attack are based upon this idea that we now had to protect the homeland. I talked about this difference between offensive and defensive strategies or responses, and the offensive response in particular focused on this idea of Gitmo and the idea that we were going to go out, we were going to find these terrorists, and we're going to bring them to justice. Again, see that kind of criminal investigation psychology coming into play there. As much as the Patriot Act was designed to protect us at home, kind of the defensive reaction, Gitmo was the offensive one, and it was we're going to go, get them and bring them here, and if we have to waterboard them to get them to tell us what we want to know, then all is good. If we're willing to give up some of our rights relative to needing to protect the homeland by passing the Patriot Act, then why wouldn't we expect some of these terrorists to give up their rights and be taken to Guantanamo Bay and held without representation? It's a new war, and it's going to be fought with new methods and new tactics, and that was kind of one of the outcomes of our response to 9/11, or at least the initial response to 9/11. So, in the end, in that first year, first 12, 18 months, the goal was to get into Afghanistan, defeat the Taliban, and find Osama bin Laden. Um, I think for a lot of Americans, there was a perception that if we could have accomplished that somehow in the first, I don't know, 2 years, or if we could have gotten Osama bin Laden in the first 3 months after, I think that would have changed the very nature and understanding of the war on terror. Um, it would have, I think it would have created a much more immediate sense of closure that would have, for instance, allowed the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan much sooner. It would have eliminated any um, need to contemplate invading Iraq in 2003. In the end, I think the initial strategy in Afghanistan was in fact sound if you were going at it in terms of we needed to find the perpetrator of the crime. But the longer bin Laden avoided U.S. capture, uh, the more other terrorist actions took place. 2002 to 2008, Europe was ground zero for terrorist activity, especially terrorist activity driven by Al Qaeda and its affiliates. And so it was almost as if we were looking for an individual. It was like we were looking for a serial killer. And at the same time, trying to get other serial killers to not follow in his footsteps.
And so it just became a really messy response to what initially was, at least in our minds, a very clearly defined war. And then came Iraq.